Indeed, consider the following. Batman pursues justice, even though there is no real justice to be had on atheism, either in this life or the next. Batman has a moral code that restricts him and minimizes what he can do, even though, on atheism, his moral code is no more objectively valid than the Joker's. And Batman suffers, is psychologically broken, and endures great pain for what is, on atheism, an ultimately meaningless mission. By contrast, the Joker is not sad or pained, but endlessly happy. No matter what happens, his life is a life full of personal pleasure and the fulfilling of the desires that he wants to fulfill. And he has no moral code to restrict him from acting as he wishes.
Well, we have already established that on your worldview, people are not judged by their immoral actions after this life. They are merely judged on whether or not they believe Jesus is the only way to heaven. So, in effect, they're not punished for the immoral actions that they take. Again, you don't have to have an absolute moral foundation in order to judge things as right or wrong. Both Batman and Joker are psychologically fucked. I don't know why you're irrationally focusing on Batman's psychological issues. And happiness is not the only way to judge whether or not somebody's life is good. Joker's a psychopath, so he's going to do whatever makes him happy no matter what. I subjectively deem that to be very bad, and there's nothing invalid about that. In the real world, we see these clashes of moral foundations taking place in politics and on social media. I mean, just today, several Middle Eastern countries banned a movie, Onward, for having a lesbian character in it. The religious right constantly wants to legislate a woman's reproductive rights as well as silence the LGBTQ community. And the important distinction to make here is that there are religious people on both sides of those arguments. Obviously, religious people even disagree with each other about their absolute moral foundation.
Consequently, on atheistic naturalism, it is the Joker's way of life that is better and more rational, or at least as good and as rational as Batman's way of life is. And yet, we all know that it is utterly absurd to claim that the Joker's way of life is either better and more rational, or even equal to Batman's way of life. Indeed, it is absolutely obvious that what Batman does and what Batman has dedicated his life to is better, more rational, more meaningful, and more praiseworthy than what the Joker does.
And you're absolutely basing this on what? Your understanding of your religion? If that's the case, then you don't know jack shit about your religion. In the Old Testament, the major sin against God that regularly fucked people up was either not worshiping God the correct way or allowing other religions to exist in their society. Those particular issues don't concern morality whatsoever. You're using your own subjective moral foundation to determine that Batman has a better way of life.
And so, we can formulate the above point into a more formal argument. Premise 1. If atheistic naturalism is true, then the Joker's way of life is better and or more rational, or at least as good and or as rational and just as meaningful as Batman's way of life is.
That's just not true. Anybody can look at the Joker and realize how irrational and psychopathic he actually is. The subjectiveness of the human experience is inescapable. All of your arguments are going to rest upon a subjective base. This would also be a false dichotomy. Like I pointed out before, he's acting as if the only possible conclusion to naturalism is Joker's nihilism. And that is simply not the case.
Premise 2. But the Joker's way of life is not better or more rational than Batman's way of life. Nor is it just as good or as rational or as meaningful as Batman's way of life. And it is clearly absurd to claim that it is.
Okay, it's clearly not better to us using our own subjective moral foundation. Also, this particular premise is predicated upon the first premise, which is flawed, therefore making your entire argument flawed.
Conclusion 1. Therefore, atheistic naturalism is false. Conclusion 2. But if atheistic naturalism is false, and remember, this is the only form of atheism that we are considering as being viable, then its opposite, namely theism, is true. Thus, at least one God exists. And so, this simple but powerful argument from absurdity is how the idea of Batman can be used to dismantle atheism and to support theism. theism over atheistic naturalism.
And your conclusion here is likewise bad because you think that you've disproven atheism and that the only option available is theism. The inherent problem with your entire argument here is that you assume that theism is the only one with a standard with which to judge moral actions. And you seem to claim that atheism has no standard to judge actions as good or bad. This is a false premise because obviously we do have our own subjective moral foundations and standards with which to judge actions as good, bad, right, and wrong. Therefore, both of these positions stand on the same ground. And you're just irrationally asserting that one doesn't have a standard with which to judge things as good or bad. And you're just irrationally asserting that one is better than the other. What I've been able to show in this video is that the Joker receives no actual punishment for the immoral actions that he commits during his life on the idea that theism, or specifically Christianity, is the true view of reality. This is because God does not punish people for the immoral actions that they commit in this life. Rather, he punishes people for not believing appropriately. Batman takes the position of counterbalancing the Joker and providing actual justice that can be seen in reality. And this is regardless of whether or not that justice or those punishments deter the criminal behavior. The only position that seems to provide some punishment or justice for the immoral actions that we commit in this life is the atheistic naturalism that you're arguing against.